You and I go way back. You talked about the Chicago Wisdom Project starting in 2009, and that's around the time we met actually in Hyde Park. So I'm glad to have met you around the time of, the birth of such an important project.
Yeah, I
Um,
think we met shortly after I had just returned to Chicago and started it. Yeah, some
yeah, because
around
I
that time.
remember you had like a flyer about it,
Mhm.
and it was also about something about your first book, Cosmos
That's
Sophia.
right. That's right.
And
So that must
and
have been yeah, around 2011, I think. Yeah,
is it
something like
11?
that. Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah,
I think it's earlier, but it's okay. We
maybe it
can
was. Yeah.
we can we can talk about the timeline some other
Yeah.
time. But
Yeah.
yeah, so go way back. I guess at least 10 years.
Yeah.
I've seen the work, and we've collaborated actually at some point. If you remember, I wrote a screenplay, and I got support from the Chicago Wisdom Project. So
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
that connection too. And
That's
we
right.
used to have many, many cool conversations in some of your favorite coffee shops in the South Side of Chicago,
Yeah. That's right.
right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. You were
um,
missed. You were missed here on the south
yeah,
side
I
of
miss you.
Chicago.
Yeah. So, one of the first things I want to ask you about, you talked a lot about loneliness and the inner climate of
Mhm.
loneliness. And I want you to kind of talk a little bit about that distinction between loneliness and aloneness.
Mhm.
Because obviously, aloneness is not necessarily a negative thing, right? And
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
something that we need
Or
sometimes,
solitude,
or
you might say.
solitude. So, if you can
Yeah.
reflect on that, especially in the age of coronavirus.
Mm. Yeah, and I think of when I think of, solitude, I think of, I think of Rilke's work a lot, actually. He writes beautifully about kind of the value and beauty and importance of solitude. We all kind of need solitude. Living in a house with in a family of five, I'm never alone. But I think, and actually, it takes real work to find that solitude that's important to all of us, so we can have that kind of rich inner life. But the question is then, like, what does that mean to have an inner life, and what do we think about our interior lives in terms of their relationship to the outer world? And I'm sort of, pushing back against and critiquing some of the kind of ways in which we often tend to think of this kind of dualism between the inner and outer, this kind of absolute dualism between the inner and outer worlds, um, and the dualism between kind of our interior psychological lives and the kind of outer material world out there, and thinking in terms of crisis, thinking about how, like, there can be a crisis. There's not a for me there's not a strong distinction between the inner and the outer crisis that I was talking about. So I'm really thinking, when I'm talking about loneliness, I'm thinking about what I would call as kind of a cosmic loneliness, like the sort of like fundamental question about who we are and what is our place in the cosmos. How do we define our sense of self? I often draw from this, and I don't know that reference in the talk, but I often draw from this kind of notion of no self, anatman, that you hear in Buddhist philosophy, right? This idea that there really is no isolated individual self. It's not that we don't exist, but we exist fundamentally in relationship. And when we begin to understand how fundamentally relational we are, we can then begin to the notion of loneliness becomes an impossibility. You know, we can be alone for sure, and that's important to be alone, and take those moments for reflection. But I mean, I think it's interesting. I think for many of us in today's world, we are never alone, in the sense that we're always connected through a smartphone or some other device, always in communication with someone. And yet at the same time, when we think about our fundamental identity, who we are, we really are sort of like pushed towards thinking about this really kind of isolated self. And I'm thinking, and so I'm associating the notion of loneliness with that real kind of like fundamentally individualistic self that separates us from others, and also not just really people, also, but like this sort of web of relationships, the web of the natural world as well.
Yeah, and since you mentioned the Buddhist concept of anatta or no self, I'm thinking also of how in meditation, uh, in experiencing aloneness, you're actually experiencing the fullness of the world as well. So there's kind
Mm,
of a
yeah, yeah,
paradoxical experience there. And of
absolutely.
course, Thich Nhat Hanh really captures that with the concept of interbeing,
Yes,
right? That
exactly.
being is
Right.
always interbeing. I just want to encourage participants to use the Q&A feature if they have questions or comments. Another thing that I wanted to touch upon in the earlier keynote speech by Dr. Babette Babish that I moderated, she talked about screen beings. She had this critique of screen beings, and you had actually, that's a word that you used a lot. Uh, this how we're actually disconnected, not connected through the screen. And she even talked about how the screen could be smudgy, and you wouldn't even notice how dirty it is because we're completely disembodied in our disconnection. So that's actually an interesting parallel
Yeah,
between those
I,
two
for sure.
speeches. Yeah.
And yeah, this notion, this like hyper connectivity, but it's a connectivity that's like, it's a two-dimensional connectivity, I like to say, right? So, on a screen, we only have two dimensions, and the dimension that we lack is this dimension of depth, right? So we don't have this kind of same access. We're disembodied, and we're also sort of like so often presenting ourselves in these kind of like two-dimensional, superficial ways to one another. And I think that something's really lost in that. We lose some of the kind of like texture of life and of relationship through those relationships.
Yeah, I really liked your second principle of the textured world. Uh, the depth that we lose, when we're just connecting through screens and not by being outside or reading books or listening to music or dancing or what have you. So
Mhm.
here's a question from one of the participants. What is the biggest challenge you have confronted in working with teens in the Chicago Wisdom Project?
The biggest challenge, I think, I think that I think I'd sort of speak to and I don't know that this is a unique challenge to the specific people I've worked with, but I think it's a challenge that we face in any kind of in any context in which we're trying to do this kind of work. What we're looking to do is we're looking to kind of like create a context for people to reimagine their stories and their fundamental sense of who they are. So giving them the sort of like tools and the context to do that. Um, so here's the challenge with that. The challenge is that like they have like a whole like civilization that is teaching them that they are primarily consumers, rather than creators, and that is pushing a narrative that is a highly sort of like what I refer to as a deficit narrative that teaches them like they're fundamentally flawed and at fault for anything that's happened to them, rather than thinking about themselves as having value and being an asset and something to contribute. So it's really overcoming that core narrative is this kind of it's fundamental to the work that I've done, and I think it's the big challenge to do the work, But I would suggest that would be the same challenge if I worked, I teach at the university level as well, and I have some of the same challenges there too. It's not, it's I don't know that I think it spans different demographic groups across, I think, much of kind of the civilization, which is really rooted in kind of that cosmology that I referred to in the talk. So I think overcoming those core assumptions that people aren't aware of is probably the biggest challenge. And of course there are like a million little challenges as well, but I think that's the kind of core challenge that we're working through.
And of course, the cosmology of disconnection that you're talking about is also in the context of neoliberalism. So this individualistic self that you talked about is also the consumer self.
Yeah.
And I think I love that you push back, and your heart is in terms of social justice. So if you can reflect on also, that was one of the questions I asked earlier to also Dr. Babish, how COVID-19 actually affects racialized people the most. I live in New Mexico. The highest cases, highest deaths are Navajo Nation, so indigenous communities, of course, also people of color in general in urban communities. So there's that aspect, but there's also the policing and the brutality that we're seeing also to enforce some of the physical distancing rules. So if you can reflect on that too, because I know this is something you care deeply about.
Yeah, so I mean, it's absolutely this. I mean, the demographics are different, like the specifics are different from where you are. You know, here on the south side of Chicago, it's different, obviously a different context, but it's the same sort of basic thing that you've described, right? It's, you know, here in the community I live in, it's primarily poor African American people who are the most adversely affected by COVID-19, and it's just, there are a variety of reasons for it. It's primarily because of the structural racism of our society, though. Um, and, you know, you mentioned the kind of simultaneous, then sort of like kind of draconian enforcement of the social distancing. That's rooted in a couple of things, right? So let's start with why it is that, you know, communities of color in the United States anyway are more affected by COVID-19. It's interesting because we have, you know, there's kind of a battle of narratives going on about that. One of those narratives is that, like, it's the fault of the individuals because they haven't taken care of themselves and aren't following the rules, right? So that's like that deficit narrative, something wrong with you, that's your fault, right? Which completely ignores, like, you know, 400 years of history, you know, on this continent, in terms of, like, you know, limiting access to healthcare and all kinds of other things that would kind of equalize the impact of the disease. So there's that factor, and there's also the factor of, like, people who are marginalized, people who've been consistently marginalized for, as I said, hundreds of years. It's going to be more of a challenge in terms of, like, you know, communicating and building trust, and like the way that oftentimes, from what I've seen in Chicago anyway, is when young people or people of color are not following the distancing guidelines, the response is, it's not that, you know, we haven't communicated effectively to this community and built trust with this community. If often it's like there's something wrong with them, it's their fault, they're not following the rules, you know. Which is you know, it's often the case that if a group of people has never felt that rules were designed for their own benefit, it's much less likely they're going to follow those rules. And I think there's a lot of, you know, and that there is a kind of racial component to that. There's also a generational component too. I think that younger people are not often don't feel as though they are being listened to and spoken to, right? So I think there's a generational component to that I've observed here, at least here in Chicago, with the way some of that stuff has been communicated and dealt with.
Here's a question from one of the participants. Do you see any alternative to the logic of late capitalism? Are people willing to compromise growth and consumerism for saving the planet? Can eco-socialism be the answer?
That is the question, isn't it? Right? Yeah, good question. I mean, I think that there are a few layers to the question, right? So the first part was, do I see an alternative? I think the way I would answer that is there absolutely is an alternative, and has to be an alternative, and will be an alternative one way or another, because our current system is unsustainable. The question about whether people will willingly sacrifice growth for, you know, to how was the phrase, to save the planet? I think it was the way it was saved. It was framed. I think it's very difficult for this reason, because capitalism serves not just as a system of exchange, and it also serves as an entire cosmology and worldview. It informs people's sense of self, you know. And I think if you look at how people react to almost everything, this sort of a hyper individualized response to kind of any kind of problem that arises, certainly in American culture, is the product of that enforcement of that highly individualistic worldview. So there's a lot of work to be done on that, you know. I think that I wouldn't say that I personally have the answer to the alternative of what comes after the capitalist system. I think that requires a real kind of collaboration and kind of deep listening and work together, and listening to those who have not benefited from the capitalist system as much as those who have. Meaning, outside of the sort of centers of power, I think there's a lot of wisdom about what might come next. You know, I think that, but I think the work, and the reason I've sort of framed my work as education, isn't isn't because I only am concerned with actual schools, but I'm concerned with sort of like ways that we can sort of enter into a dialogue and teaching and learning processes where we can begin to reimagine those kind of core values, that hyper individualism of capitalism. Until we begin to sort of like tell new stories about who we are, we certainly won't have an alternative. We certainly won't, because the system that we have is really strongly embedded, I think, in the civilization and in the culture. So, you know, it requires both good ideas, but also requires new kind of new stories. You know. I can't hear.
I am sorry. I'm
Oh,
sorry. I
it's okay.
forgot to press that button. Robert has a little bit of connection issues, so I'm taking over. We have a few more questions coming in from the audience, which is nice. And I'm just going to read them to you. So, as Alfonso Williams is asking, do you notice a difference in the expression of your students between those who prefer to use social media as the primary mode for narrative engagement versus those who say use the arts for life narrative engagement, where social media is just a stooge to live to the life event?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that you know, social media has been, you know, I don't know that there are, I think, how can I put it? I think that, you know, social media, most of us are using social media a lot, and particularly younger people are almost all using social media all the time. So I think that, you know, the challenge with social media, I would say like this, I think the challenge with social media is to like relearn how to like listen and pay attention to what's happening there, because we're so inundated with all this information that often we're not really ready to really fully process it in a deep and meaningful way. And I think that slowing down and doing, you know, and engaging through the arts is a little bit, you know, adds that kind of layer of depth. You know, I think of that sort of like Robert's comment earlier about kind of thinking about the difference between kind of embodied, you know, textured, three-dimensional interactivity, as opposed to kind of the superficial, you know, interactivity that we often have on online and in social media. So I think that social media is a way of communicating, but the sort of deep work that we're doing really requires something much more than that through the arts, and creating stories, creating symbols, creating even ideas in ways that require just kind of a fuller, more complete engagement, you know, and a little bit of a slowing down is important too in that. So the challenge with social media is a big challenge, because I think it really does discourage that kind of like slow reflection and deep work that's really required for us to live richer, fuller lives, but also to really kind of challenge some of the dominant narratives that we're given. And so really the way we engage social media primarily has been really just to kind of like, you think of it as something that we really need to kind of like pursue mindfully and pay attention to what's going on.
Thank you. We have another interesting question that I think connects to what you just said. Do you think that the disenfranchised and those who have not benefited from capitalism have a voice to be heard? And maybe if I can add to this, how can we make this voice heard? What are your ideas there?
Yeah. So yeah, I think the last part you added on is really the question, because I think absolutely it's true that you know, there is a challenge with you know, I think first of all, I think there's, and maybe I think I said this in the talk somewhere, that there's a real value in multiple perspectives, just generally, you know, just like a kind of just like monocultural farming, it can do damage to the soil. You know, we need sort of like more balanced ecologies. We also need diverse kind of cultural ecologies in order to have a more kind of thriving conversation about our place in the world. One of the things that I think our current system does, it does it in education, it does it in the media, it does it in a lot of it, is it sort of funnels a much kind of narrower view of the world. is ideal, because we have fewer and fewer like real alternatives, genuine alternatives. And I think we see that in the political discourse as well. So, I'd add to that too, that I think we have to pay attention to power and power relationships. And I would suggest that those who are kind of on the margins or disenfranchised, I think as the question framed it, have something to offer, not just out of the sake of diversity for diversity's sake, but because from the vantage point of being kind of outside of the system, or at least not benefiting from the system as much as those who are in positions of power, I think there's an ability to kind of see things more clearly. So the real, and fundamentally, that's been the work that I've been doing in Chicago, is that it's providing kind of spaces for those voices to be kind of like cultivated and heard, and honored. More than anything else, I think that's really the kind of main purpose of the work that we've done. But it's not easy. I mean, it's not one of the biggest challenges, I think is to sort of like listen to people who don't have the power. That's not, systems aren't set up to give power to people who don't have them, generally speaking. So, that is a huge challenge. It's a huge kind of civilizational challenge. But I would tend to think that our survival depends on it, and I think that kind of democratic spirit that the question sort of alludes to has to be part of the answer to kind of climate change, or dealing with COVID-19, or any of these crises. I think we have to think not just in terms of the specifics of the crisis, but also kind of how we're thinking of the crisis in human relationships.
Another question, one of our participants sent in: throughout your keynote, duality is recurred. What about the force often found in between the poles of these spectral dimensions, ambivalence?
Yeah, so I think that really is the point. I think that we have to learn to kind of think of the cosmology of disconnection, as I describe it, really sort of like categorizes things in these kind of dualities, as you say. And I think that the reality is even each of us is much more kind of nuanced and paradoxical and complex than that. And the sort of way of thinking that I am advocating for is really honors that kind of uncertainty, that kind of paradoxical nature of the world. I mean, surely, if nothing else, a lesson that we can get from the pandemic is that the sort of certainty we thought we had about our world is not real. It's as illusory as any other illusion we might have, and can be often harmful. So I think that my answer is just sort of yes. That's yeah, you know what I mean? Like it's absolutely fundamentally important that we begin to like really embrace kind of ambivalence and not knowing, that kind of the epistemic humility that is, I think, a part of real wisdom. We don't know everything, we can't know everything, and we can't control everything. I think that's really fundamentally important for I think a healthy individual and a healthy civilization.
Yeah, so one of the cores of understanding wisdom, right? Like
yes.
To know what you cannot change and to kind of recognize where you can make a difference. So do you think that like this whole COVID-19 situation, is there actually something we can learn out of it when it comes to wisdom? It's maybe a little bit provocative to ask that question.
Yeah. I'll answer it but I will preface my answer by saying, that there is a lot of suffering involved with COVID-19, and I don't want to in any way minimize it by suggesting that this is a good thing, but in any situation, I think the question is what can we learn from it? I'd suggest that we're certainly learning that we have less control over our lives than we thought, and we're learning that much of what we spend our time doing is perhaps not as essential or as important as we thought it was. You know, that's certainly a lesson that's there. And we're also learning the kind of delusion of our individual kind of isolation in the world, you know, that decisions made on one side of the planet can affect people on the other. And just how real, how deeply entangled we are with each other, and how hard it is to really truly separate ourselves, right? So this kind of notion of this like radical individualism and separation, it doesn't appear to be the case when we really look at how difficult it is to kind of like, you know, separate ourselves from one another and to not bear the brunt of the crisis, no matter where we live.
Thank you so much, Theodore, for your wonderful talk and for the great Q&A session. Maybe I could, well, I would like to take the chance to invite everyone to continue this discussion on Slack. Maybe you want to join, Theodore, that would be great. Thanks again to everyone. Thanks for attending. Thanks for the talk. And see you all tomorrow, hopefully.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.